G'day ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Draw with Jazza. I'm Jazza, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some best practices and some really cool tips and tricks and approaches that you can use when creating dynamic and action-packed poses with your characters. And when getting started, I should let you know this is not a guide to anatomy and the physical body itself, more on the actual dynamics of creating cool poses and sketching them. So if you're interested in learning about anatomy and how that can apply to your poses, I'd encourage you to check out my reference pack and my ebook, which are bundled together. They are the Draw with Jazza Easy Anatomy ebook, which goes into detail in the form and function in an approachable way of male and female anatomy, and of course the photo reference pack, which has male and female athletic models posing in a whole bunch of different action poses with and without props, and it has isolated images of them on different angles and isolated body parts demonstrating form and function. So go check that out, and because I love you and because you're early to this video, the first 100 people to use the coupon code 00JAZZA will get my anatomy bundle at a further 20% off the already discounted 20% off. So go check it out with the link in the card and in the description. But moving on, today we're going to talk about how you can make action-packed poses in a more effortless way than we can sometimes feel it is. Because the process of making dynamic poses can be sometimes frustrating and difficult to know where to start or how to refine. So let's get started. The first thing I want to mention and sort of get out of the way is just to say that it's not a crime to copy. Poses are difficult, especially dynamic poses, and there are endless references out there and inspirations for you, and if you're going to approach something as complex as a dynamic pose, you're bound to hit points of frustration. Not all the time, but fairly often. So in saying that, especially if you're learning and not very experienced, there is no shame in copying. I still do it from time to time, and it's a great way to learn and sort of dedicate to your artistic memory the way that muscles work together, some great techniques like specific hand poses and some really cool silhouettes. Though I would say to keep in mind that rather than copying a pose exactly, try and stretch yourself outside of the boundaries of just a simple rigid copy. As you can see, what I'm drawing right now is almost a one-for-one copy of the actual character's pose, but once I've actually copied the anatomy and used the reference as far as I need it, I then allow myself to experiment and play outside of the boundaries of that initial pose and add things like a costume and various props, change the facial features and other aspects of the design so that I end up with something that is obviously derivative of the pose that I've copied, but also sort of something on its own, and I've been able to express myself and learn in the process. The next point I want to cover is construction, the building up of the image from simple details, slowly blocking in the elements of the pose, and then over time refining and building up the anatomy, silhouette, and solidity of your pose. I like to approach this in 3 steps. The first being the skeleton, which you can see in the red. The next being the rough anatomy blocking, which you can see me doing in the blue. This is really simplistic. It doesn't go into too much detail, but essentially is putting the meat on the bones, so to speak. And then the final step, after we've blocked in the anatomy and we're happy with the overall silhouette and pose, is adding the details and refining your image. Going in and polishing up things like the facial expression, adding details to the hair and clothing, props, so on and so forth. By building up an image in steps like this, and keep in mind it doesn't actually have to follow these exact steps or my exact method, but in working from a place of simplicity as your foundation, it really takes a lot of the pressure and stress out of creating complex poses. I personally use elements of these different forms of construction depending on what I'm creating a pose from. If it's something really simple and straightforward, sometimes I won't even do the skeleton step. I'll skip straight forward to the silhouette and the meat on the bones, so to speak. But in the more complex things where we have limbs flailing about or foreshortening or some more dramatic action happening, I like to work through these steps in a way to slowly build up a solid and appealing pose. Now that example I gave with the blue and red colors and with not much undoing and redoing was a very constructed example and not one sort of representative of what it actually looks like when I'm sketching. So this is what it looks like when I personally am trying to figure out a pose and sketching it in my sketchbook. As you can see, I do start off with elements of a skeleton, but it's not a complete skeleton. And then beyond that, I'm not always 100% set on it. Even if I've drawn the skeleton and I move on to roughing in the anatomy or the blocking, I'll start to see where things are less comfortable or look a bit awkward, and I can remove and erase elements and slowly add and tweak things as I bit by bit move towards an organic looking pose. It's important to keep your sketching really light and rough and to not put too much refinement in, because you need to allow yourself to feel comfortable with the idea of erasing chunks of your image if it's not looking great. If you overcommit or add too much detail, you're not going to want to undo things, and then you will end up stuck with something from time to time that looks more awkward than you would have liked. On the plus side, once you are happy with your pose and you feel like it looks comfortable and organic, you can start to build up the details, refine the silhouette, and add elements of interest to your image until eventually you have something that looks pretty cool. You can add your line work, add your final refining details, and when you erase your construction lines, you end up with an image that looks fairly effortless and almost as if there wasn't that much planning and erasing and meddling about as you saw me go through in the beginning. And that's one of the traps of looking at other people's art and seeing epic, refined poses. We sort of assume they just drew that there wasn't a bunch of mistakes or steps in the process. But there nearly always is. When you're drawing your poses, you will go through ugly phases and you may have to completely start again several times. And that's okay. Just chill out about it, don't hate yourself for it, and have a bit of fun. The next thing I highly recommend, especially if you're looking to create an extreme pose and have something specific you want to accomplish, for example, a dynamic charging attack with a sword, I think it can be really worthwhile to create what's called thumbnail sketches. Really low pressure, very scribbly silhouettes of poses, just the basic anatomy and silhouette of the character type you plan on creating your pose with. Do a bunch on one page and don't spend too long on a single pose, and if you feel like you've drawn one that's pretty cool, draw something else completely different, just to let yourself not overcommit too early. After maybe a group of 4 or 5 or so sketches, you might find a couple that you don't mind. It can also be useful to not jump straight from your thumbnail sketch to a refined final image. It can be worthwhile doing a slightly larger, only very slightly more detailed version of that pose, because you will find yourself making some little tweaks and refining the silhouette very slightly to find the most organic and comfortable version of that pose that you already like. It's not a final concept or pose yet, but it can be further refined in a few steps before you get to your final image creation process. I want to very briefly touch on my personal opinion on the idea of using lines of motion, which you may have seen in how to draw books where there's a pose and a fluid looking single line that shows the direction of action. I always found that confusing when I was learning to draw. I felt like I was supposed to somehow incorporate that before my illustration to get the right direction or sense of action. To be completely honest, I never used the concept of a line of motion. I think it's more of a useful thing to illustrate an element of action rather than as a useful part of sketching and refining a pose. So I wouldn't worry about incorporating the line of motion thing too much, in my personal opinion. But one thing I do think is quite useful to keep in mind when creating dynamic poses is to twist or bend the torso and the waist, to often have the shoulders at a different angle and facing a different way than the hips. This can create some really cool interest in the body. The next thing I want to talk about, which I did cover in my sketching video, but I do want to cover here because it's quite relevant to creating poses, and that is the idea that there are different kinds of sketching, different ways of sketching. And the first is what you've seen me do for most of this video so far, this very rough, haphazard way of sketching and scribbling, erasing as you go, and not very neatly, but very loosely and organically building up the pose as you go. It's very comfortable and it can look kind of cool too, but it's also a little difficult to work with when creating a final illustration, something you may want to create line work and color on. So my personal preference is to work in this really rough, haphazard way when figuring things out, but then when I'm set on what I want to do and I move on to a final piece of paper to create a refined image on, my sketching style changes and I work much more lightly. I don't intend on working so organically that I'll constantly erase and redraw what I've done because I've decided what I want to draw. So while there will be fixes and nips and tucks here and there, overall I'm trying to create something that I know what it will look like, usually based on the sketch that I've already done. The main points of difference in the ways that I sketch are that my hand is much lighter on the paper. I don't build up bulky areas of line. I focus mainly on the silhouette and occasionally very light areas of detail within the image, but the focus is really on the form and solidity of the design. When that gets to a place where it feels pretty refined and ready to add your final line work and art on, it acts as a really clean foundation and something that avoids avoids visual confusion, is easy to work with later when you erase the construction lines. It just makes for overall much cleaner results, and I find more accurate representations of anatomy and physicality in your illustrations because everything's much more intentional and the approach is much slower and a little more careful. The next thing I want to talk about is foreshortening. As you can see with this cylinder, on the very left we have something with no foreshortening, it looks very flat, and then on the right we have something with nothing but foreshortening, which still looks very flat. In the middle we have this 3/4 perspective, which looks pretty dynamic. It's moving towards us and it feels three-dimensional. Beyond that, if we use that sort of angle, we can warp the geometry a bit and make it look like this cylinder is flying at us and has a lot of intensity, even though the proportions aren't exact. It communicates exactly what the cylinder is supposed to be and looks like, but we can tweak it and make it look more powerful. That is the power of foreshortening. So when applied to a human arm, you can see on the left we have a very flat looking muscular arm. With just a little foreshortening added, you can see that it feels more three-dimensional, it's more dynamic, and we have a greater sense of depth. With even more foreshortening added, specifically with the fist more directly towards the viewer, we're really starting to see the physical shape and the layers of depth as these muscles intertwine and the fist is pointed towards us. And then in the final image of pretty much nothing but foreshortening, it seems to go flat a little bit again, and things are a little harder to read and understand. So I tend to try and have elements in my image that sit somewhere in the middle. Parts of a pose or character that are just popping forward a little bit and creating a sense of depth. And like in my example of the cylinder, you can warp and use perspective and really intensify a pose by accentuating the foreshortening and creating that real sense of perspective and action. Now, I've said perspective a few times, and that is worth keeping in mind because it can help to draw perspective lines as a guide to follow when you're creating something as extremely foreshortened as this. And if you still find it confusing on how to draw your body shapes in these foreshortened poses, it can once again help to break things down into very simple blocks and shapes, and you can use those in conjunction with things like perspective lines to slowly build up the limbs and the foreshortened elements. The other thing to keep in mind is overlap. The closer the part of a body is to you, the lines that make up that body part will be in front of and laying on top of the other parts of that limb or body part. A little trick I like to use when creating a very extreme foreshortened pose is to create three-dimensional circular lines along the limb that is being foreshortened, which creates a bit of a three-dimensional look all the way along the limb. That helps my eye understand exactly what I'm going for without any confusion, and then I can add detail in the middle there with confidence and then build up the silhouette, and then later on those lines can be removed. The very last thing I want to mention when it comes to drawing poses is that you need to lower your expectations. Aside from it being perfectly reasonable, if not recommended, to remove and add and recreate elements of your pose as you go, I would also recommend to keep in mind that if it's feeling too awkward or you're getting too frustrated, to scrap it and start again. This is almost always the best way to go about it. Starting with a clean slate and a slightly different approach has always, in my experience, led to better results. And it also helps me understand and refine my idea of what I'm going for as I go for it. What you're seeing now is the third attempt of a fairly simple thing I wanted to create, which is an action pose of my JAZZA avatar holding a pencil in a dynamic way. And on my third attempt, I started to feel like I was hitting the right spot. And as you can see, once the core elements were in a place I was happy with, there's still plenty of nips and tucks and little bits I refine here and there. But overall, it's the foundation that took me the longest to get right, which I made several attempts at. Once the foundation's right, the nips and tucks are the easy bit. In fact, it can be really satisfying just to make these tiny little changes that make it cooler and cooler as you go. But try not to put too much pressure on yourself or get too disappointed if it feels too awkward to continue. It may just be too awkward to continue. Just drop it and start again, and try and have fun with the next go round. So there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. They are my best practices and a bunch of tips and tricks and approaches that you can use when creating your poses. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my video on sketching, where I go into the process of how to relax and create cool different kinds of sketches and highlight and accentuate different parts of your sketches to make them stand out. I will plug myself once again because it's a huge support to this channel and myself to go check out that discount code. There are only 100 coupons using JAZZA to get the further 20% off. That's JAZZA in all caps, and you will get 20% off of the anatomy bundle if you're among the first 100 people to use it. Draw with JAZZA Easy Anatomy is my ebook guide on the approachable and enjoyable way of creating anatomy without the convoluted complexity that so many anatomy guides have. A guide to both form and function, and to easily memorize and incorporate accurate and athletic anatomy into your cartoons and comic books. And then of course we have the photo reference and pose pack, which has the male and female models in a whole bunch of different poses, action and normal, isolated body parts to show what the muscles look and contract like in different poses, and of course my personal favorite, the different action poses with cool props that you can use as a reference when you create your own comics and cartoons. And all of those poses are on 4 different angles, which should really help you understand the methods of foreshortening and how the muscles look in different angles. So go check that out. The coupon code is limited, but the bundle is always 20% off of the individual items, and I really put a lot of effort to make it as useful and fun as possible. Once again, the link is in the card and in the description. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun putting it together for you, and if you're interested in a different 101 tutorial, let me know what you'd be interested to go into, whether it be faces and expressions, environments, or effects. I'd be interested to know what you guys are interested in learning. Go leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Make sure to subscribe to Draw with JAZZA if you haven't. We have loads of fun with art here, whether it be learning things like this now and then, or having challenges, competitions, and a whole bunch of quirky adventures with art. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later. Make sure to subscribe to my channel to see more of my videos. And while you're at it, check out my shop where I sell ebooks, brushes, photo references, video courses, and more. There's another video you might enjoy from my channel over there, and you can also check out my behind the scenes daily vlog channel, Daily JAZZA. That's it for now, and until next time, I'll see you later.